After the events of the loop, things went back to normal for the rest of the Steves. They went on to have their own adventures and grow as a society. This is Rainbow Quest Aftermath: The Blue Kingdom, Part 5 of the 8-part series. It had been a little over a month since the Red Steves revealed themselves to the rest of the Steve civilizations. The Blue Leader, regularly attending meetings, heard about the Redstone Towers in the Overworld Kingdoms, the completion of the Orange and Yellow Kingdoms, and the newfound adventure of the Green Steves. To the Blue Leader, the Redstone Towers seemed arbitrary, to say the least. Understandable, as the spirit world had no need for such technology. Walking out of his house, he stared off into the distance, over the water, the icy biome around him. Closing the door behind him, he walked over the grave he had set up for the Blue Steve who was turned into Soul. Lightly touching one of the blue orchids with the back of his hand, he sighed. Although it couldn't be helped anymore, it was a shame what had happened to him. He wished he could have done more for his friend. Flashbacks started to flood the Blue Leader's mind as he remembered that day. Being trapped in his house, Sabre and Rainbow Steve trying to save him, being knocked into the portal. All while watching the only mentor he had become corrupted by darkness. Standing up, he turned and started to walk back to his home. As he was walking to the staircase, he felt a chill down his spine. At first, he thought it was a result of the colder biome he lived in, but then a whisper. The Blue Leader called out, thinking that it may have been one of the many past Steves that resided in the world beyond. Oddly, no response. Slightly shaken, the Blue Leader walked back to his house to contemplate what had just occurred. The next day, he spoke with some other Blue Steves, asking them if they had ever experienced anything of the sort, describing his predicament to them. None of them had, to his surprise. The closest thing they came up with was the feeling when a new spirit entered the world beyond, a feeling which the leader was quite familiar with. Without any luck amongst the other Steves of his end of the spectrum, the Blue Leader decided to speak with the other leaders, to see if he could figure out any sort of hypothesis for the events that had transpired. The Blue Leader stepped outside his house and began to teleport. However, as he started to break the dimensional barrier, a loud, piercing screech could be heard. Right then and there, the barrier was broken, and the Blue Leader was in the overworld. Not a single sign of anything out of place. The only things he could feel was a shivering cold and a traumatizing fear. After collecting himself, he immediately contacted the other leaders and told them to come to the abandoned library. Once all the leaders were present in the meeting room, the Blue Leader began to speak. He told them of the eerie accounts he had been having over the past few days and asked them if any of them knew what to do. The Green, Violet, and Red leaders all seemed the most interested at what the Blue Leader was talking about. The Green and Violet leaders were to be expected, as they cared the most about the health and mental states of other Steves. The Red Leader seemed to be more interested, with more of a sense of wonder and equal fear of the situation. After a moment of contemplating, the Red Leader asked Blue to come with him, as he knew someone who might be able to help. The Blue Leader, confused what he meant, was still happy to oblige. After teleporting to the Red Kingdom, the Red Leader asked the Blue Leader to follow him. The Blue Leader, while still fearing for his situation, was in awe at the beauty of the Red Kingdom, having never seen it before. After walking through the kingdom, the Blue and Red leaders stopped at the doorway of the professor's laboratory. Entering it, they both began walking down the stairs. Once they had reached the bottom, the Red Leader called for the professor, who was working on the miniature core inside the main part of his workshop, which was powering the building. After explaining what had happened to the professor, the Blue Leader sat in silence, waiting for a response. The professor sat in thought for a moment, stood up, and told the Blue Leader to follow him. Once they reached the lower parts of the lab, the Blue Leader noticed an orange robot working on modifying a machine that was set up in the area. The professor told the Blue Leader that this machine would analyze him to make sure it wasn't something neurological. The Blue Leader reluctantly entered the machine and was immediately locked into a chamber. The professor, monitoring some charts and machines on the desk, looked puzzled for a moment. After some more explanation, the Blue Leader exited the machine and was curious as to what the professor had discovered. Speaking with him, the professor told him that there was only one issue that he could see and understand. He told the Blue Leader that since Blue Steves had been in the spirit world for so long, that they had evolved to have similar properties to that world. As far as the professor could tell from the stories that the Blue Steves told, the world beyond was less physical than the overworld, to the point of almost being purely made of energy. Blue Steves fell somewhere in between, being mostly physical beings, but not quite. He explained that this may have been what was causing the strange feeling of fear that the Blue Leader was experiencing while teleporting. He could not, however, explain the strange noises or the feeling of cold. While not exactly the answer he was looking for, the Blue Leader thanked the professor for the little information he could give. He then decided to go back to the spirit world to sleep on this knowledge and attempt to come up with a solution himself. Failing to come up with a solution himself, the Blue Leader was at a loss. He couldn't bring any normal Steves to the world beyond. Even if he could find the Great Librarian spirit, the knowledge that he once possessed had mostly faded from his memory by that point. Then, in a single moment, he thought of something that just might work. He thought that maybe he could try to get the thing that was bothering him to the overworld. As he ran out of his house, almost tripping down the stairs, he stood in the flatter area of his house and tried to get whatever was after him to come out. Eventually, he got that strange feeling again, the feeling of cold. The second he felt it, the blue leader summoned bolts of lightning. As he did so, he heard those eerie screeches once more. As the blue leader continued to channel lightning more and more, he started to see movement. Something was moving fast around him. The more lightning he summoned, the more the creature began to show. Once it was at a reasonable pace, he started to get closer to the creature. Once close enough, he started to teleport. In a raging storm of lightning, he teleported both himself and the creature back to the overworld. The blue leader, after returning to the overworld, observed the odd behavior of the creature. It was thrashing in every direction, phasing in and out of what seemed like existence itself. In a moment of pure horror, the screaming creature began to fall apart, tearing into pieces in front of him. The creature seemed to burn up and simply disappear. Standing alone in the plains, the blue leader was almost paralyzed at what he had just witnessed. While glad the creature was destroyed when he brought it to the overworld, the blue leader was pretty sure that wouldn't be the last he'd see of it. After being able to step away from his location, he immediately teleported to the Red Kingdom to inform the professor of what he had just done. Running into the professor's lab and calling his name, he ran up the stairs where the professor was sitting at his telescope. After informing him about what had happened, the professor contemplated for a minute or two. After thinking, the professor informed the blue leader that it was very possible that the creature couldn't handle the physical world, as from its description, it seemed to be made of mostly energy, similar to the world beyond itself. The blue leader chimed in, saying that this mostly happened when he was attempting to teleport. The professor explained that perhaps these creatures were so light in the matter that made them up, and that going in and out of dimensions could disturb the natural structure that contains them. He then went on to explain how it very well could work in the opposite direction as well, and that may be the reason regular Steves can't go to the world beyond. The blue leader then questioned why Sabre and Rainbow Steve could have been able to travel there when the darkness was taking over. The professor stated that Sabre wasn't from their world, so the rules that apply to the Steves may not have worked in the same way for him, and that Rainbow had the blue crystal infused with him at the time, which granted him the abilities of blue Steves. After gaining this information, the blue leader asked the professor if he had any sort of plan to find out what these things were and how to stop them from occurring again in the future. The professor stood up and with a salmon in hand ran down the stairs, telling the blue leader to come back in a few days, as he'd have something prepared. After a few days, the blue leader returned to the Red Kingdom to look at what the professor had created. Walking into the lab and down the staircase, he noticed that pieces of machinery and redstone had been pulled from the wall. It was strange to see Professor Red's lab in such a cleaned up state. Walking down to the machine he was locked into, he realized where all the resources went. The professor had built a huge machine in the lower portion of the workshop. After noticing the blue leader, the professor ran up to him. He started in on a rant, talking about science, dimensional energy, and a bunch of stuff the blue leader couldn't even understand. After asking the professor to slow down, he started to explain in a way the blue leader could understand. He explained that if the spirit world was a pool of water, and someone traveling there was a rock, that whenever someone physical traveled to the world beyond, it would cause ripples through the weak fabric of that dimension, such as a rock splashing in water. He went on to explain that those ripples would travel through the creatures and disturb them, similar to how a block of TNT exploding would tear through a normal Steve. After this explanation, the blue leader then asked why the creatures would be interested in disturbing him, if he was only partially physical. The professor answered him by explaining that him just being in the spirit world would not be enough to disturb the creatures, but maybe his new constant travel to the overworld for meetings with other leaders and other things such as that were causing these ripples to become more frequent. The ripples may have finally caught up to him. After being informed about this, the blue leader asked what could be done, to which the professor guided him to the massive machine he had been working on. He explained that the machine would use a small group of blue Steves as an input to the chamber. Their energy would be used to mimic a small pocket of the same energy that the spirit world was made out of. He then said that using this continuous flow of energy from the blue Steves would allow a stable pocket for one of these creatures to be trapped in. Blue leader, of course, asked if this was safe, to which the professor slowly turned to him and made a witty comment about it definitely being 100% safe. While the blue leader didn't fully believe him, he thought that as long as the red leader thought it was safe enough to use, then he would give it a shot. After transporting some blue Steves into the professor's lab, the blue leader informed them of what the plan was. Some blue Steves were hesitant to the idea, but agreed nonetheless. After being strapped into the machines, The Blue Steves were told exactly what was supposed to happen by the professor. After hearing the entire plan, they were ready, nodding. The professor flipped the lever. Lightning happened on all the Steves, and the glass chamber was filled with the spirit world energy. Once he was given the okay, the Blue Leader went to the world beyond. Once he was there, he got the attention of another creature. After he got its attention, he repeated the method he had previously used to teleport the creature to the overworld, summoning more and more lightning, trying to slow the creature down to a pace to which he could manage. Once it was to that point, he teleported. The professor watched as lightning began to rage around him, some in the machine and some next to him. He turned to see the Blue Leader emerging from a haze of white electricity. Turning back to the machine, he watched as lightning bounced off the walls in the inner chamber, turning to block the bright light from his eyes. He heard the lightning fade away. Squinting, he saw a figure in the chamber. Now, getting a good look at it, the Blue Leader could only describe it as some sort of ghoul or ghost. Looking to be made of pure soul energy, the ghoul was infuriated, banging on the chamber window, flailing around. The Blue Leader asked the professor if he was sure that thing could be held by the machine. Professor Red, not quite sure himself, wanted to stay on the optimistic side of things, telling the Blue Leader not to worry, and that there's a reason he was currently the smartest person in their world. Slightly scoffing, the Blue Leader looked over at the machine, getting closer to it. He could hear the same screeches and screams coming from the ghoul that he had heard on multiple occasions while teleporting. All of a sudden, the ghoul started thrashing back and forth, flying in every direction. The Blue Leader yelled to the professor, asking him what was happening. From what the professor could tell, the machine was being overloaded. The amount of spirit world energy input from the Blue Steves was overloading the redstone energy holding the chamber together. In a single moment, the machine exploded in a flash of energy, knocking out the Blue Leader. When the Blue Leader came to, he noticed that the machine had been blown to bits. Looking over to where the Blue Steves had been locked into the machine, he noticed that thankfully none of them had been destroyed or hurt. Looking back over to the main chamber, he noticed that there was something in the crater that the explosion caused. Waking up the professor, he asked him what it was. The professor, not quite knowing, called Assistant Steve over to the site to analyze the rubble. Assistant Steve, after scanning the odd properties of the area, determined that because of the constant input of energy from the spirit world, a one-way dimensional rift had been created. Scanning the nearby area, the assistant stated that because of the rift, a huge blast of world-beyond energy had been spread over the Red Kingdom, and unfortunately, had affected the energy output of the core. Professor Red then chimed in with a sound of worry in his voice. If the core's energy output had been affected, that means that any kingdom with a redstone tower would have the same issue, as the core was linked to anything of the sort. In an instant, the Red Leader ran up to the lab. He asked what had happened, as the rest of the kingdom was in a state of panic. The professor explained the situation, and as he was doing so, Light Steve teleported in. Every kingdom that had redstone towers installed were also experiencing these anomalies. Traveling to the kingdoms, the Blue Leaders saw chaos. Crowds of Steves running amok. Ghouls chasing Steves through the streets. A blue haze covered each kingdom. Spirit world energy covering every area. The Blue Leader was at a loss. Just because he wanted to test on these things, they were now attacking almost every kingdom. Going back to the Red Kingdom, he looked around at the broken machine, the unconscious Blue Steves on the sidelines. After looking at the chaos that had ensued in the area, the Blue Leader had a spark of inspiration from the machine. Running to the professor, he informed him of his idea, to try and reconstruct the machine but on a bigger scale. Make a machine large enough that he and the rest of the Blue Steves could transfer to the world beyond. If they could at least get a safe containment field in an area in the spirit world, they could attempt to teleport the ghouls back to there, while they wouldn't be destroyed. They would be in a machine that could hold them in a certain area and deflect the overworld energy coming in and out of the world beyond. The professor thought for a moment and told the Blue Leader that in order to get them all to that location at once, they would have to lead them back to the Red Kingdom. The Blue Leader agreed to this proposition and started to wake up the other Blue Steves. Once they were all awake, the Blue Steves were informed of the plan to return the ghouls to the outskirts of the old Rainbow Kingdom, where Professor Red would construct the machine. While the professor was constructing the machine, the Blue Steves all went to a different colored kingdom. Once they were there, they attempted to get a rough estimate of how many ghouls there were. After they obtained that knowledge, they contacted the professor, and he began the calibrations. With the Red Leader and Assistant Steve helping the professor, they made quick work of the task of constructing the machine. As they were completing it, the professor informed them that once he turned it on, there would be a limited amount of time the field could sustain itself in the overworld. The Blue Steves understood and rushed to contain the ghouls, teleporting them each, one by one, to the machine. The The Blue Steves made quick work of the issue. By the time they were finished, they even had time to spare before needing to transport the machine. The Blue leader thanked the professor for his help, and together with the other Blue Steves transported the machine to a safe place in the world beyond. The professor explained that the machine was leeching off of the energy of the spirit world itself, and transferring that energy into the main energy field would mean that they wouldn't have to worry about it combusting again, or the ghouls being in constant turmoil because of the physical presence of the machine. The spirit world rift, however, was not going to be so easy to close, since it connected the two dimensions. The Blue leader thought that perhaps the Indigo leader could help, having the power of connection. He might know what to do. Once the Indigo leader arrived, he told the Blue leader that he should be able to close the rift with the help of the professor and a small group of Blue Steves. Agreeing to the proposition, the Blue leader gathered the small party of Blue Steves that were gathered near the lab, and Professor Red then created a system of currents that could assist the Indigo leader in utilizing the Blue Steve's spirit energy to close the connection to the spirit world. Although the ghouls were no longer a threat, the Blue leader wanted to prevent a situation like this from happening again. He approached and asked the Indigo leader if it were possible to create waypoints in both the middle and spirit worlds, which would act to lighten the load of physical energy from the overworld entering the world beyond. By dividing it between two dimensions, the Indigo leader expressed that it was theoretically possible. With the help of both the Blue and Indigo Steves, these waypoints were created. With the ghouls being dealt with and the Indigo Steves beginning to help the Blue Steves optimize travel between dimensions, that concludes Rainbow Quest Aftermath: The Blue Kingdom, Part 5 of the 8-part series. Thank you so much for watching. As we near the end of this 8-part series, we will be concluding the Rainbow Quest story, a story filled with friendship, passion, and of people who will never give up. And of course, as always, thank you to my members, otherwise known as my super supporters, for supporting my channel. If you guys are enjoying these videos, please hit that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment down below. And as always, I'll see you next time.